Good afternoon, dear professors and dear guests. It is always a great honor for us to host you in the Comparative Law Seminar Series. Welcome all and thank you for being with us today. This event is co-organized by Kadhiras University Faculty of Law and Kadhiras University Liability Law Research and Practice Center. Today we will listen Associate Professor Dr. Valentina Rita Scotti with her presentation on gender equality, a legal principle under treat. But firstly, I would like to give the floor to Associate Professor Dr. Nilay Arat, the Director of Kadhiras University Liability Law Research and Practice Center. Please, Professor.
Thank you very much, Aslı. It's again my great pleasure and honor to welcome you all of my distinguished colleagues and our guests to the second of Comparative Law Seminar Series in 2022, which is jointly organized by Kadhiras University Faculty of Law and Kadhiras Liability Research and Practice Center. We have started our Comparative Law Seminar Series in 2021 and held very fruitful seminars till today. And now we are hosting a very distinguished colleague and a very special friend, Associate Professor Dr. Valentina Rita Scotti, who has an extended research interest in Turkish constitutional law and who calls feels Istanbul as home. If you allow me, I'd like to offer a few words about as regards to our special guest today. First, I would like to extend my warmest wishes and warmest welcome to our guest today, our distinguished colleague, Dr. Scotti from European Law and Governance School. Dr. Scotti holds a PhD in comparative public law from University of Siena, and she publishes in Italian and international reviews and edited volumes on constitutionalism and human rights in the Mediterranean area, cross-fertilization of legal models, and parliamentary cooperation. In 2014, she published her first monograph on constitutionalism in Turkey between national identity and cross-fertilization in Italian. And now a new book is on the way this May about Turkey again. From 2007 and 2010, she also worked at the Italian Ministry of Environment, mainly as consultant for the legal office. She taught and she gave lectures, and she worked very internationally. I mean, till now in Italy, in Turkey, in Greece, and all. Currently, she's a resident associate professor of comparative law at the European Law and Governance School of the European Public Law Organization. Dear Valentina, dear friend, dear distinguished colleague, I leave the floor for your valuable contributions today. And again, thank you for honoring us today. Please.
Thank you very much for this very kind presentation, and it is my pleasure and my personal honor to be here with you today. As you said, I feel at home when I am among Turkish colleagues. So let me very wholeheartedly thank both Professor Tupukcu and Professor Arat for the invitation, and also Professor Baysal for her presence here, even though I know that we are all very busy in these times. So thank you very much for this invitation. I will try to briefly talk about the main treat under which the principle of gender equality is exposed nowadays, starting from some preliminary remarks and also starting from a terminological clarification. So what I will try to do is not to tell you about all the threats that only recently the principle of gender equality is exposed to, but try to provide for you also an historical recollection under the perspective of the comparative law. So let me start with the first preliminary remark, which is about the framework in which my speech is going to take place. I will mainly refer to the development of the principle of gender equality into the Western legal culture. I'm saying this because, as you know, different legal cultures have observed a different evolution of the principle of gender equality. And even though a universalistic conception of this principle as affirmed, we would say after the Second World War, mainly thanks to the activism of the United Nations and of other supranational organizations, this universalistic conception is sometimes challenged in post-colonial studies. I don't want to enter in this debate, but I just would like to underscore that my speech is framed in the Western legal culture environment so that you can easily understand to which concepts I'm referring to. Another clarification brings us already into the topic, because the first question, I will try to develop my speech in subsequent questions. And the first question that we can put forward is a very basic one. What is a woman? When we talk about gender equality, defining what is a woman is a fundamental question. And this is a question that Simone de Beauvoir posed in her book, which is very renowned, The Second Sex. She underscored that the concept of woman has been historically defined by men by constructing the otherness of women in a binary system, also inferring a hierarchical structure stating their inferiority. So this definition is extremely important for us because in itself, it recollects the history of women's subjugation. If we look at the thinkers, the most famous thinkers that we have had during the history, starting from ancient Greece, from Plato and Aristotle, we see that women have been relegated in subaltern roles, even in their construction of an ideal society. And when it comes to the developments of the Western legal culture, we cannot avoid to mention that in Christian countries, the so-called fathers of the church, like Thomas Aquinas or Paul, kept this subaltern role for women, grounding it on the tale of the original sin. So the fact that the first man, the first couple, was expelled from the heaven is connected to the sin that the woman perpetrated, convincing also the man. Starting from this, for instance, Thomas Aquinas said that women are deficient et occasionatus, which we can translate from Latin as defective and misbegotten. And Aquinas also imagined a society in which, exactly as Christ is the head of the church, the man is the head of the family. So women has to be, to respect all the orders coming from men, from the manager, we can say, of the household. And it is exactly in this context that this hierarchical pattern has been developed. At the time, we were observing patriarchal households in which the preservation of the power was granted thanks to this alliance between the male holders of the state power and the male clergy. A brief digression may allow me to state that even in an Islamic environment where the original sin is not relevant, still we have observed a similar alliance between the holders of the power and the male interpreters of religious precepts. And also this alliance has marginalized women. I'm mentioning this because some scholars have underscored that that when Islam appeared, it allowed for a greater consideration for women than the other monotheists. And it was this alliance between the holders of the power and the interpreters of the rule that crystallized the religious norms, definitively creating a complementary role for women. Of course, I'm not a theologue, so I cannot assess whether this is true with regard to an Islamic environment, but I wanted to underscore this because most of us, we are grown up in a society based on the Huntington's theory of the clash of civilization, and after the 11th September 2001, we got used to this idea that Islam is intrinsically violating rights and moreover women's rights. So in order to put forward all the potential interpretations, I also wanted to underscore that there are scholars according to which this is not exactly true, and it is the interpretation of the religious sources that matters in building this complementarity. The same can be said when we look again at the Christian environment. A crystallization of a certain interpretation has consolidated the complementarity. And this is what we can see nowadays coming from a different interpretation from the church, and also from the consolidation of the principle of secularism that completely detaches the legal perspective from the religious perspective. And what matters for us today is basically the legal perspective. This complementarity that has been established with the support, with the instrumental use of religious sources in the legal perspective became relevant with regard to two main elements. First of all, we can mention the definition of women's legal personality. I believe that the best way for explaining the challenges to which the recognition of a full legal personality women have been historically exposed comes from the theory that William Blackstone elaborated with regard to the property rights of women, which is called the theory of the legal coverture. According to this renowned British scholar, women after the marriage lost their legal personality because it was covered by the legal personality of the man, of the husband in this case. This basically meant that even though they owned properties, the property right passed to the husband together with the legal personality. And this has been also the main element that has been used for a very long time to refuse voting rights to women. It was believed under this theory of legal personality that women expressed their vote through the vote expressed by the husband. With no surprise, we saw that this approach was followed in Switzerland until the 70s of the last century. So until 1970, women in Switzerland were not allowed to vote, and the last enfranchisement in a canton in Switzerland occurred in 1990. So only when it was absolutely necessary in order to be recognized as a contracting party for the European Convention of Human Rights. Before then, this moment, the theory of coverture was applied in Switzerland, and there were female movements campaigning against the enfranchisement, believing that expressing the vote through the head of the family was a sufficient recognition. So just for giving you a full idea of how the legal personality, as the recognition of the legal personality has represented a challenge for women. Another threat that we can mention is exactly related to enfranchisement. we know that when the United States abolished slavery through the 14 and 15 amendments to the Constitution, women movement started to believe that through these amendments, they could have had recognized their voting rights, because actually these two amendments equalized all the people born in the USA to American citizens, meaning that also slaves were recognized as American citizens, and to all of them, voting rights were recognized. American women, US women thought that, okay, as long as we are citizens, this amendment recognizes to us voting rights, but this was not the case. And as you know, it was necessary to wait and to fight for the approval of the 19th Amendment in 1920 to secure voting rights. And it resulted mainly as an octroi, we would say, from President Wilson recognizing the war efforts of American women. So it was not a recognition of a right. It was more a gentle concession of the male elite to women just because they sided them in the war effort. And yet we have another example still from North America in another famous case, which is passed to the history as the Persons case, which is the case Edward versus Canada, decided by the Privy Council in 1929. This case is very interesting because, again, it calls into question the way in which interpreters decide to look at the law. We are referring here to Section 24 of the British North American Act, according to which the Governor General had to appoint senators among qualified persons. The neutrality of this term, persons, made women believe that they were allowed to be appointed at the Senate, at the Canadian Senate. But in 1928, the Supreme Court of Canada established that women cannot be conceived as persons, according, in order to benefit from Section 24. And they used here the same interpretation of the term persons that had been already used in order to exclude women from serving as judges. So in the Canadian environment, it was stated that for legal purposes, women could not be recognized as persons. It was necessary to wait this 1929 interpretation of the Privy Council, stating that no matter which was the original intent of the framer, in that historical moment, it was impossible to deny legal personality to women, and they had to be allowed to serve in the Senate and to serve as judges. But these are all examples that brings us back to the main question: what is a woman? Through the history, it has been extremely difficult to define what is a woman. And even when the legal personality was recognized, we know that feminist movements fought importantly, put a lot of efforts in order to have recognized what we call the formal equality. So the very first fight for women was to have recognized, to obtain the same rights granted to men, so that the same treatment for similarly situated issues was recognized, notwithstanding sexual differences. This is what liberal feminism basically tried to achieve. And we may say that this has been achieved almost all around the world. If we look at the constitutions of almost all the states existing nowadays, the recognition of formal equality is stated. But here it comes another question, which around which scholars still immensely debate. Is there a difference between sex and gender? So do we have to treat differently sex differences and gender differences? Actually, scholars of humanities have divided sex and gender, stating that sex is a biological given determined at birth, while gender is a set of socially constructed roles for each sex. Even though nowadays in the legal field, in the law field, we see that this difference is recognized, still for a long time, the two nouns have been used interchangeably. And we can observe this even in the scholarship and in the speech of one of the most important defendants of women's rights that I think we mourn immensely since she passed away, which is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Justice Ginsburg, which lately served also as a judge in the US Supreme Court, but was also a scholar, an American scholar, and a defendant of gender equality, started to use the two terms interchangeably because she thought, and you can find this quotation in one of her books, she tells the tale of her secretary that was typing, transcripting her speeches in order to prepare the documents to be presented at the Supreme Court. And she told her, I realized that you repeat the word sex so many times in these speeches that I'm afraid people will confuse the word with sexual intercourses. And so in order to nuance this, she started to use the word gender. She said, I was afraid that to sensitive minds, the recurrent use of the word sex could have distracted them. So I preferred to use the word gender. This partially helped in that moment. In the 70s, this helped in a very Puritan society, as the US one, using another noun was played an ancillary role in supporting the cause of gender equality. Nevertheless, this has also created some confusion, and this is the reason why scholars are still struggling whether to use sexual differences, gender differences, in order to define all those discriminations that can be connected to these differences. Personally, I keep using gender-based discrimination or gender-based differences, but I have to recognize that this confusion in a legal perspective derives from the fact that sexuality is commonly dependent on the social structures where it develops, and at the same time, gender is socially conceived starting from biological differentiation. So we can understand why there is still need to discuss around these two nouns. But this need of defining sex and gender brings us also to two other questions. So we can ask, if there are these differences, are there sex-linked roles or attributes that are important to preserve? And if there are, such roles, how they can coexist with an egalitarian environment, with egalitarian ideas. So this is, according to me, the real challenge that we still face nowadays when talking about gender equality. How to balance the recognition of certain sex-linked roles with the principle of gender equality. If we look at the constitution-making moments occurred since the end of the Second World War, what we see is that framers tried to overcome the atrocities of the previous period by stating an absolute prohibition of discrimination, which included also sex. Nevertheless, at the same time, they tried to protect certain sex-linked roles, such as maternity. And I can give to you some examples coming from the 1948 Italian Constitution of obscure, unclear provisions or provisions that could have and have led to conservative interpretations. For instance, Article 9 of the Italian Constitution, as it is still currently into force, establishes the equality of spouses, but, and I'm quoting, within the limits of the safeguard of the family unity. On this ground, for decades, the Italian judiciary has justified the difference in criminal sanction between male and female adultery. So just for complete information, a single occurrence of female adultery was punished up to 5 years of prison. In order to be punished for adultery, men had to have an official concubine. So a long-lasting and established relation. This was in order to safeguard the family unity, because even a single occurrence of a sexual intercourse with another man could have endangered the lineage, which was not the case with the adultery of the man. Only in 1968, the Italian Constitutional Court declared the unconstitutionality of this provision of the criminal code and abolished the criminal sanction for adultery. Another case is Article 31 of the Italian Constitution, which imposed to the state the duty to protect maternity. This duty has been used for the same, almost the same amount of time in order to elude the debate on the decriminalization of the voluntary interruption of pregnancy. And it was necessary again to wait the intervention of the Constitutional Court in 1975 to state that a law was needed in order to rule on voluntary interruption of pregnancy and to urge the legislator to approve a law. So as you can see, we have a list of threats that can be immediately inferred reading the constitutions, which also shows us that even behind the neutral provisions, there can come threats to the principle of gender equality. What we can also say when it comes to constitutional interpretation and to the protection of gender equality is also strongly connected to the language of the Constitution and to the way the recognition of rights based on gender equality occurs. So if we have to look at whether we are talking of negative or positive rights. And it is well known that when I say negative rights, I'm saying that they imply a duty of the state not to interfere. And when I'm saying a positive rights, I'm saying that the constitutional provisions provision imposes an obligation on the state, a duty to intervene. At a first glance, this may seem not very relevant when we talk about the implementation and enforcement of gender equality, but actually it is. Let me give you some examples. When, for instance, we talk about reproductive rights, immediately you can understand the difference between a provision stating the right to choice, so a negative right, and a provision imposing the state the duty to allow all women to accede to reproductive treatments, notwithstanding their social, ethnic, and economic status. In this different way of shaping the provision, we see the jump from formal equality to substantial equality, which is realized also through the so-called affirmative actions. The state has to intervene in order to remove all the obstacles that can be posed to the effective enjoyment of gender equality. But even when we look at positive obligations, we can ask, how are they implemented? So just to give you another example, when we look at political participation, several states have decided to introduce gender quotas in order to favor the presence of women in decision-making positions. Of course, some other states have decided to ignore completely the possibility of introducing quotas, believing that the equality of the possibilities of accessing decision-making bodies is already sufficient, and they supported more the so-called meritocratic principle, according to which if a woman is worthy to enter in a decision-making assembly, she will do it. The countries that introduced quotas grounded the introduction on the idea that this positive action is needed in order to overcome historically consolidated discriminations. But if I say introducing quotas, this is not enough. This is, of course, a positive obligation, but in itself, it doesn't say anything, because we also have to look at what kind of quota we are introducing. So, for instance, if we are talking to party quotas, so if we just impose that political parties have to elaborate candidate lists containing a minimum amount of female candidates, basically we are not really having an affirmative action, because what we generally observe is that men are candidated in the first positions of the list, which are those that really have a chance to obtain a seat in parliament, and women are candidated just for a making up operation. Something different is instead the decision that, for instance, has been taken at the moment of the elaboration of the 2014 electoral law in Tunisia. Here we have observed that the law required the political party to elaborate candidate lists alternating the sex of the candidates. And this produced two benefits. On one side, we observed a real equality in the list, looking at the names, but also it produced the positive effect that even when a man was promoted, you know that in 2014, Tunisia was transitioning from Ben Ali regime to a more democratic regime during under the consequences of the so-called Jasmine Revolution. So it was very frequent that men who candidated to the parliament were then promoted to other important offices in the new state. Because of this alternate position in the candidate list, when a man was promoted in a higher position, a woman advanced in any case, in an important office. So the presence of women was importantly ensured in that moment, in that historical moment of the country. And we could see this in the composition of the Constituent Assembly and the Parliament of Tunisia in that period. So once again, positive obligations are not sufficient. The way in which they are conceived has a fundamental impact. No need to say that the same can be said with regard to the participation of women in executives or in bureaucracies. Here we have for a very long time observed a marginalization of women only in those ministries or agencies that were considered to be in female affairs, like social affairs, probably education, but only very recently we have observed that a greater number of women started to be appointed at ministries of the defense, foreign ministers, and this is not yet a reality all over the world, not even all over Western countries. And I may say the same with regard to the judiciary. Once again, you can immediately grab the relevance of having women sitting in the judiciary, women sitting in constitutional or Supreme Court when it comes to the interpretation of provisions in line with gender equality. The absence of women in these positions increases the possibility that an heteropatriarchal interpretation of a constitutional provision is provided. Finally, there is also another element that has to be taken into consideration when we talk about the constitutional threats that can be associated with the implementation of gender equality, which is connected to the territorial distribution of the power and the competencies inside the state. So even when we talk about centralized states, and this is even more true when we talk about federal states or regional states, we see that important competencies are recognized to local authorities. Well, the fact that these competencies are recognized to local authorities may increase the discrimination among women, because different local authorities may treat differently similar situations. Just to give you another example coming from the US, we can mention the case of the recent case about the law on abortion in Texas. We had that huge debate exactly because Texas had the competence to decide on that matter. It was not a federal competence, but it was a competence of the state. So even in this regard, constitutional framers should take into consideration that even when allocating competencies to local authority, there should be the need of providing redressing mechanisms in case of discriminations among these authorities. There are, beside of these, also subtle threats that can be posed to gender equality, which, as I anticipated before, come from neutral provisions. And I believe that the recent experience that unfortunately we all went through with the pandemic gives us important instantiations in this regard. So as we all know, the main measure that has been used all over the world in order to face the pandemic have been the lockdowns. Closing people at home, avoid any social contact. And this is assumed to be a neutral measure, which impacted both men and women. Everyone was imposed to stay at home. Actually, this is not true. If we look at the statistics, if we look at the reports that are going to be elaborated, which have been elaborated in these recent months, we see that the lockdowns have represented for women a double burden. women have seen an increased amount of domestic responsibilities and of caring duties. Several of them incurred in a job loss or had to resign in order to take care of children or elderly that were locked down at home as well. And this is just one instantiation. We have also observed that women were exposed more than men to health risks because all over the world, the nurses are predominantly women. So this means that they were more close to COVID patients, moreover at the beginning of the pandemic. And also, we have observed an increased number of cases of domestic violence to which women have exposed to. This is a trend that we are already aware of because we already know that, for instance, during the weekends and during the holidays, the number of domestic violence increase just because the people live together in the same house and there are more chances in terms of time. But in the case of the pandemic, with regard to domestic violence, we have seen that not only women were more exposed to their abusive partners, but they also had less chances to accede to shelters. They were more dependent on their abusive partners from an economic point of view because of the job loss that I have mentioned before. So all these situations immensely impacted on women more than men. And all these occurred as a consequence of a measure meant to be neutral. There was not a patriarchal intent or a discriminatory intent in the definition of lockdowns as measures for facing the pandemic. As you might have seen, as you might have seen, until now, all my speech about gender equality can be summarized more as a speech looking at the potential threat to parity between men and women. But there is another understanding of gender equality that, in my opinion, is even more challenged than the parity between men and women, which is the recognition of equality, notwithstanding gender orientation. This is another very big question. What is gender orientation? We can roughly define gender orientation as the gender preferences of an individual, which don't have to be necessarily associated with their biological sex. This definition, as you can understand, since the beginning challenges the binary heteropatriarchal conception of the society that we have described until now. And we see that several states have decided to interpret the provision of gender equality that have been included in their statutory laws and in their constitution as excluding a recognition of equality meant as equality also with regard to gender orientation, which has meant very, very briefly that the LGBTQIA+ people have not obtained the same rights guaranteed to heterosexual people. Of course, you are familiar with the fact that Turkey decided to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention because of the fact that it could entrench in the legal system a duty to recognize rights to the LGBTQIA+ people in a way that challenges the country's vision of the family. I may say that even though such a duty is not explicitly stated anywhere in the convention. This rationale has been used not only in Turkey to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention, but also in other European states, such as Hungary and Romania, that on this ground refused to ratify the convention. In Poland, we have seen that an even greater challenge came to the recognition of equality to the LGBTQIA+ people when some local authorities tried to establish homosexual-free areas in order to secure families. All of these in an environment in which the executive was challenging and succeeded in challenging the law on abortion, using a certain populistic rhetoric enforced with the reference to Christian values. And we can see that even in those states, having adopted a more liberal stance with regard to gender equality and having decided to recognize the prohibition of discrimination grounded on gender orientation, still troubles in breaking heteropatriarchy have been observed. Very clear instantiations are the difficulties in recognizing same-sex couples' rights. I'm not talking only of marriage, but also, for instance, the recognition of inheritance rights or insurance rights are connected to this. Another instantiation is the difficulty of recognizing the right to the adoption, or at least to the stepchild adoption, which has been discussed for a very long time, and even in states formally recognizing the prohibition of discrimination on gender orientation, still same-sex couples have not acceded to the same set of rights of heterosexual couples. So in this regard, what we observe is that even formal equality has not been fully achieved yet. So, concludingly, and thanking you for your attention, what I can say is that gender equality is a principle that, with regard to the law in the book, with regard to the formal recognition, has been achieved mostly all around the world, but this is a principle that is still challenged with regard to the substantial equality, and it is under threat because of several reasons. First of all, a threat comes from heteropatriarchal social constructions enforced by conservative interpretations of religious precepts, which are experiencing a revival in recent years. Moreover, in those countries that are observing the emergence of populist regimes, and I mentioned the case of Poland, but I can provide for you several other examples, Italy included, of political parties that are detaching from the tradition of populist parties which are indifferent to the gender division among their electorate, and they are instead trying to enforce an idea of gender complementarity. Another threat comes from the increased attention for competitive issues. This is a very, very concrete challenge. The implementation of positive obligations requires funds. In several occasions, funds for the implementation of gender equality are distorted to other issues when they are conceived as more urgent. A case can be, for instance, and here it is very important to understand how to balance these. For instance, to send weapons to Ukraine. In Italy, we have, for instance, increased the military expenses for sending more weapons to Ukraine. And of course, some of us can recognize the importance of these. personally, I have a more pacifistic stance, but still I understand those who believe that Ukraine shall be supported by sending weapons. The question that I pose is that where the funds were come from. And finally, another and the final threat that I'm going to mention is the one which we toured around during this speech, how neutral provisions can hide a patriarchal intent or can create adversarial effects in the implementation, even when discriminatory intent were not in the mind of the framers. So, as you can see, almost every element of my speech of today shall deserve further considerations, further explanations. Even a whole month of speech would not be enough for fully telling you about this topic. But I will stop here, and I'll thank you once again for having me here, and I'll remain at disposal for your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Scotti. I'm really happy, and all of us, I guess, we are. It was really fruitful for us to listen to you in such an important topic. So now, please, all are welcome to share their questions, comments, and contributions. You may write in the chat section as well, but also you may raise hand and ask orally your question. I would like to remind that we have reserved 15 minutes for the discussion. So all are welcome, your questions, contributions. The first one is always difficult.
The ice-breaking moment.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Maybe I can start actually. Firstly, when you said about the women's positions in constitutional courts, I immediately remembered, it's just a contribution by the way, I immediately remembered Turkish Constitutional Court, that there is no female member. And in the last election process, they did not elect a female member again. So just to remember, and as we have always many problems in Turkey, especially related to states' positive obligations on the elimination of violence against women, I guess that it's really important to have female members in such positions, especially in the courts. So I would like to just, remember that point. So any questions or contributions?
May I?
Yes, please, Professor.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to thank you, dear friend, dear Valentina, for her very comprehensive speech seminar. It was very mind-opening for me. And I would like to ask, actually, I'm curious about what you think about, let's say, the reconciliation of the issues. On the one hand, the gender quota, and on the other hand, the qualification issue. I mean, for example, let's say, just to give an example, if we have 4 candidates for a position and the least qualified is female, I mean, the qualification issue, I mean, whether if the female one is still the least qualified. But on the other hand, if we have this quota, the gender quota, how should we reconcile this issue? I mean, or any reconciliation needed, necessary? I'm just curious about this issue from the beginning of the quota issue, like maybe 15, 20 years back. I'm just asking this question to myself, and I have I have some thoughts, but I couldn't reconcile. I couldn't have reconciled the issues yet. I just remember your. I'm just curious about your assessment on the issue. Thank you.
So do you want me to answer, or you want to collect if there are other questions and then I answer? What would you prefer?
How you will prepare actually, is it okay for you to, yeah, okay, great. So let's move like that.
So let me say that it seems an easy question because it's just what is your opinion? But actually this is a question that I was thinking about, I may say, since when I started my academic career, because I had a mentor which was extremely in favor of quotas. And I remember that I was arguing with her. She was a feminist. She was very committed in the history of Italian feminism. And I remember that I was talking with her several times saying, but no, it is a meritocracy that has to prevail. Women have to be talented enough, otherwise we are awarding a position to mediocrity, and I disagree with this. I think that, okay, and I was approximately 23 years old at the time. Then growing up and observing personally and also through other colleagues how historically constructed social discriminations can really affect women, I started to reconsider my position. And some suggestions came to me also by looking at the Northern European experiences. It is true that the quota system can favor less meritorious women instead of more meritorious men. But the Northern European experience has shown, empirically shown, that this is just in the transitionary period. So this is just in the first moment from the introduction of quotas. Then it starts to become a sort of mental habit for the society, for the political environment, which has also a spillover effect in other fields. And in the second phase, we observe that there is almost no need of quotas anymore, because equally meritorious people compete for the same position. Still, I also have difficulties in fully accepting the need of quotas. Sometimes I believe, for instance, when it comes to political participation, I would be in favor of reintroducing something that my generation almost lost, which is schools of politics made by political parties, where a full political awareness can be consolidated. But also, and in this case, I would like to see an attention to gender equality, such as, for instance, not fixing the meeting when women are supposed to take care of children, not organizing meetings during the weekends. So there are a lot of small elements that can be introduced in order to allow women participating in politics and in decision-making moments, even before then reaching quotas. Still, I believe that our countries, namely Mediterranean countries, we would immensely benefit of quotas in order to increase the presence of women in politics.
Thank you very much. So any other questions? Charles Martin, yes, I guess you're raising hand, right? Yeah, okay. So please.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Professor Scotti. It was a very fruitful presentation for us. My question is actually about your personal observation about this. Well, a lot of university principles are not recognized in Turkey due to the notion of public order. And I think it must be, at least it used to be almost the same in other countries. And well, as much as I know, public order is a general notion that almost every constitution contains. So what's your observation about the transformation of public order in Italy or any other countries that you have studied? Thank you for us.
This is another question that may take years to be answered. This is absolutely true. It's not something that is valid only for Turkey. Several other countries, Italy has done the same. In a comparative perspective, I would say that many European countries have used the protection of public order in order to hamper the development of gender equality. And this is generally done not at the level of the constitutions, but at the level of statutory legislation. So what we generally observe is that laws are implemented diminishing the guarantee of rights provided in the Constitution. Okay, let me clarify it. Generally, we have programmatic provisions in the Constitution. So generally stating the duty of the state to provide for something. The way these programmatic provisions are then developed in the laws are generally diminishing the protection of gender equality because of the need of balancing it with another interest, which is the protection of public order. And this is the reason why we observe a diminishing protection of women. Just to give you an example that comes from Italy, on this ground, on the preservation of the stability of the society, public order, social security, and all of these, for a very long time, Italy has justified things like the reparatory marriage, the crime of honor, because they were meant as measures to keep the society calm. So again, my understanding, I'm Italian, I've been living in Turkey, now I'm in Greece. I've been traveling around Mediterranean countries. What I can say is that there is a certain heteropatriarchal approach to legal aspects that is common to all Mediterranean countries and probably comes from ancestral culture and creates an hindrance to gender equality.
Thank you very much again. So I have a question. Okay, as a direct message, I have actually 3 questions. One is from Yavuz Aslan. He's a research assistant at our faculty. He says, so I will read it. He says, "Thank you, Professor Scotti, for your all-around presentation. What do you think about the low percentage of female professors and researchers in the European universities? I have read that the number and percentage of the female university professors and researchers in Turkey are more than those at any EU member state. Thank you," he says.
Okay, I don't have an exactly statistic about this, so it can be true. It can be true. What we, yes, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised because it is true that I have a lot of Turkish colleagues, so it can be true. But what I would be interested in knowing is at what level are women assessed. So if we take the academic world as a whole, okay, maybe we can observe a majority of women. This can be valid also for teachers in secondary schools, high school, if we take it as a bunch, probably we have a majority of women. I would be interested in knowing the statistics with regard to the presence of women and men as full professors, dean of schools, and rectors, because it is like a pyramid. On the lower grounds, there are a lot of women, but the more it becomes on top, it comes on top, we see that the number of women lessen and apical hierarchical positions are taken by men. And this is not only for academia. We have seen this in companies, in enterprises. I haven't mentioned this in my speech, but in the European Union, for instance, there is a law for a directive actually for encouraging stock market option companies to have at least a percentage, if I'm not wrong, 40% of women in their executive board. And I know, for instance, that Turkey has not adopted any legislation as such, but there is a voluntary code coming from Borsa Istanbul trying to implement this percentage. So all over the world, we observe that if you look at the lower ranks, it's full of women, because actually women have the highest level of graduation from school. They are generally in these generations more successful than men at school. But then when it comes to professional life, the pyramid still sees many, many men, old white men on top of the pyramid.
Okay, thank you very much again. Another question is from Dr. Deniz Ugan Çatalkaya. She's an assistant professor in labor law department, and she asks a question related to the woman's professional life. She would like to ask your opinions on the women's role in the family and the rising problems at home with the increase of teleworking during the pandemic, because according to International Labour Organization's researches, it is proven that women are more affected from teleworking because of the gender perception. So what are your thoughts about it, she says?
Yeah, this is exactly what I tried to underscore before, probably too briefly. It is absolutely true that women have been, let's say that overall, women are already exposed to the so-called double burden due to societal and cultural constructions. Even though women are working women, they have to take care of the house more than men when they come back home. So it's a joke that we generally play with other female colleagues. We say, okay, when they come back and they put on the dishwasher, you have to say bravo, 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 because they did something. But if we clean the house, put on the dishwasher and wash clothes, it is just that we did our duties. This is this can be a joke, but this is the reality of many women. We are exposed to the double burden of taking care of the children, of the elderly, of the house, and to work, because current societies also require us to work, not only for our personal fulfillment, but also because of the economic conditions of our countries. This is not yet required to men, but this is something that has a cultural background. And quite often, I have to say, it is mother's fault. We tend to grow up men in a different way than we grow up women. So the change starts from us. We need to grow the next generation of men as able to share domestic chores and conceiving this as normal. So this is the first element that I can add as a cultural understanding. Then it comes the fact that during the pandemic, women have been, at first, they considered the teleworking as an opportunity because they could balance in this way all the challenges coming from the restrictions, such as having the children at home because schools were closed, or dealing with shopping at the grocery because there were restricted times. But this produced an enormous adversarial effect that was cloistering them at home, reducing their job efficiency because they had to deal with the other duties. And in the end, the job loss that I was mentioning before. So data coming from the International Labour Organization are shared also by other organizations, by other index, and several scholars are working on this. It is going to be published, the Routledge Handbook, I don't remember if it is Routledge Handbook on the pandemic or Routledge Handbook on COVID-19, but in any case, it will appear soon and it will tackle also this issue.
Thank you very much. So I guess we are at the end of our session. So I would like to thank you very, very much, Professor Scotti, on behalf of Kadhiras University Faculty of Law. And dear professors, dear colleagues, and dear students, thank you very much for participating. We are now closing the session. If you don't have anything to, if you don't have last words, Professor Scotti, we are now closing.
Let me just say that it was my immense pleasure to share this time with you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's our pleasure. Thank you again. So we are now closing the session, but we are continuing the Comparative Law Seminar Series. So I hope to see you soon. Bye.